We have some more NHL signings to discuss today. We have some restricted free agents from the Carolina Hurricanes, Winnipeg Jets, and St. Louis Blues have come to terms. We'll get into all the latest coming up next. So welcome back here to Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have some breaking news from around the NHL. We have some more restricted free agents that have come to terms with their existing teams here on some new contracts. So let's first of all get started with Brock McGinn. This one was actually announced earlier on the weekend. I was just kind of waiting for some more signings to be announced to put together a full video here. Brock McGinn has signed a 2-year contract with Carolina worth $2.1 million per season. 25-year-old forward has spent the last 2 years playing as a full-time member with the Carolina Hurricanes. Of course, he had seen some NHL action prior to that, but has really been a solid full-time member of the Canes for the last 2 years, being a pretty consistent 25 to 30-point player. Also became a pretty important player for Carolina during their 2019 playoff run here, taking them pretty deep into the playoffs. Of course, he scored that big Game 7 game-winning goal here in overtime, assisted by Justin Williams, to get them out of the first round and defeat the Washington Capitals in dramatic fashion, winning the first playoff series in Canes history in quite some time here. So obviously, he's proven to be a pretty decent bottom six forward, pretty consistent player for them, and I think this is a more than fair contract between Brock McGinn here in Carolina. The Winnipeg Jets have signed defenseman Neal Pionk to a 2-year contract valued at $3 million per season. Of course, Pionk was probably one of the main pieces acquired from the Rangers in that Jacob Trouba deal. Obviously, Pionk originally played college hockey for a few years and then has spent the last year and a half playing in the NHL, has just over 100 games of NHL experience to his name, putting up over 40 points. Obviously, that's a pretty decent offensive output for his first 100 NHL games. Neal Pionk's 23 years old, but soon to be 24. He'll be turning 24 here in about a week's time. So obviously he's still pretty young, can still prove to be a pretty important piece of the Jets moving forward. Of course, we've seen some pretty significant changes on that Winnipeg blue line so far during this offseason. Not only did they trade Jacob Trouba, but they've also lost guys like Sherratt and Myers through free agency. So this blue line for the Jets this coming year is going to be very, very different, and they're certainly going to be relying on Pionk quite a bit here. So hopefully he can earn this contract by making $3 million per year. I really didn't think it'd be quite this much. I thought it might be a little bit less. I'm not surprised on the term. I thought it would be a shorter term deal to allow him to continue to prove himself here as a solid NHL rear guard. He will still be a restricted free agent defenseman at the end of this contract. So they should be able to come to terms and hopefully extend him if everything works out at that given time. But Neal Pionk certainly going to be looked upon to play a solid top 4 role for Winnipeg. And even though this contract, like I said, might be a little more than I thought he might get, given the limited experience, hopefully things work out for him and he certainly earns this contract between him and the Jets and become a pretty solid member of their top 4 defense here heading into the coming season. Now, the St. Louis Blues have signed a couple of restricted free agent players, including goaltender Ville Husso, has signed a 1-year contract, which is a 2-way deal at the league minimum $700K, should he receive time in the NHL. At one point, Ville Husso was kind of looked upon as likely being the goaltender of the future for the Blues. He'd be the guy that would come up and challenge Jake Allen for the starting role when he was ready, or at least become his backup and kind of slowly inch his way into the NHL here. But of course, last year wasn't the greatest for Husso, and of course we saw Jordan Binnington really emerge and of course get called up in January. And well, as we know, the rest there is history. He really took over, not only staying in the NHL, but taking over the starter's job, winning at an incredibly high percentage and helping take the St. Louis Blues all the way to the Stanley Cup. So that certainly, to me, puts Husso's future with the Blues in question beyond this year. He'll likely have an opportunity to hopefully be the main goaltender at their American Hockey League level and get lots of playing time and continue to build on his skill level. But it's certainly debatable if he has a future with the Blues organization or not. Obviously, that'll likely depend on the future of Jake Allen. Obviously, at this point, it seems like they're not real interested in trading him, even though he's clearly become their backup goaltender. We'll see how everything goes in training camp, but based on how the season ended, there's no reason to not think that Binnington will continue to be the starter. No reason to think that we won't go into next year and see Binnington play 55 to 60 games and Jake Allen probably play somewhere 20 to 25 games along those lines here. Of course, depending on injury and everybody staying healthy, etc. But at this point, Husso's future would only likely be if they decide to move on from Jake Allen. Then Husso and Binnington could possibly be the goaltending tandem of the future, but I guess we'll see here. Jake Allen still has 2 years left on his contract, and like I said, many people wondered if he might become a trade target this summer, but it looks as though that's not likely going to happen. They seem content to have him remain with the organization and kind of have a little bit of an expensive goaltending duo here, for at least for the one more year. We'll see how things go, and we'll see if Husso's future remains with the Blues or if it might be elsewhere after the coming year. They've also come to terms with restricted free agent forward Oskar Sundqvist. Now, Sundqvist certainly proved to be a very valuable member this season, especially during their playoff run. He appeared in 74 games and put up 31 points. Pretty solid member of that bottom six group of guys who was instrumental in helping the Blues go all the way to the Stanley Cup. Of course, the only games he missed this season was due to a concussion suffered at the hands of a Tom Wilson hit earlier in the year, which resulted in a Tom Wilson suspension. So obviously he recovered from that and really had a pretty solid year overall for the Blues, like I mentioned, and has kind of become an important player. He put up 9 points in the playoffs as well. There's certainly a lot of games in the playoffs. If you couldn't help but wonder between those third and fourth lines, which one was more valuable at times and who was really the third or the fourth. Line numbers kind of went out the window because they certainly played different roles on different nights and on different evenings. One was more important than the other depending on the game and the exact style of play that was kind of being played against different opponents throughout the playoffs here. But either way, Sundqvist has had a really nice season, proved his worth. I think this is a pretty fair contract. Keeps him in the fold for 4 years at a pretty valuable contract amount here. So I like this deal for the Blues. Now, of course, that leaves them with a little bit of an awkward scenario when it comes to their salary cap situation. I'll give you a snapshot via Cap Friendly here on the screen. They have just over $4 million left in salary cap space for the upcoming season. And they still have a couple of restricted free agents to sign as well, including defenseman Joel Edmondson and other forward here, Ivan Barbashev. Now, of course, there's also Patrick Maroon, who we know would like to return, and I think to a degree the Blues are interested, but probably can't afford to bring back all three. There's some talk that they very well might have to make a move or two here to make room on the roster, depending on who they decide to keep and who ultimately ends up leaving. But in Maroon's case, he likely wouldn't get more than a one-year contract out of St. Louis if they're able to squeeze him in. And he very well might need a multi-year deal here for this to make sense for him. As much as I know he likes playing at home, and obviously his hometown team, they won a Stanley Cup. I know he doesn't want to leave, but it's really one of his last opportunities to really cash in on a multi-year contract, should he be able to get one before his career starts to be winding down. So I guess we'll see how things go and what other moves the Blues decide to make here, but it certainly seems to be clear that they won't be able to bring back everybody who's left unsigned at this point, or unless somebody else off the existing roster gets traded out. So, of course, as always, want to know your thoughts and opinions on these contracts down in the comment section. Let me know what you think, and we'll continue the conversation here. We should certainly have plenty more restricted free agent contracts coming up here as many of these arbitration dates get closer. Most players will end up coming to terms with their teams before the arbitration hearing takes place. Usually, it's only about 1 out of every 5 cases or so actually go to arbitration and have the hearing take place. About 4 to 5 come to terms with their teams ahead of time. So we should have plenty more of those coming up here over the next little while as those dates approach for many of these guys. And of course, there's lots of RFAs as well that don't even have arbitration rates, which are mostly the bigger names on that list this year and that we've talked about many times over, of course, like Mitch Marner, Laine, Connor, Besser, McAvoy, Zach Werenski, all those guys that certainly seem to be kind of at a standstill here. There's not a whole lot of news reporting on negotiations for a lot of these players, so hopefully many of these don't drag on too long. We have some news to talk about on those fronts soon enough as well. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing as well and turning on your notification bell so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.